I grew up in Halloway, Indiana. A town so small, if you sneezed on Main Street, half the town would bless you. Everyone knew each other. Everyone knew their neighbors. And everyone knew Frank Henshaw. Frank lived at the very end of Sycamore Lane. A single-story house with faded green shutters and a perfectly cut lawn. He was ordinary, just another middle-aged guy with a quiet life. Always wore the same gray work jacket. Always walked his old beagle, Rusty. Always waved when he saw you. He was the kind of neighbor you trusted. Until one day we didn't. The change was slow. So slow we almost didn't notice. It started with small things. Frank stopped mowing his lawn. Stopped walking Rusty. When he saw you, he stared instead of waving. Like he was studying you. Like he was waiting. Then one morning Rusty was gone. My dad, Tom, mentioned it over breakfast. Haven't seen Henshaw's dog in a while. My mom shrugged. Maybe he ran off. But I knew Rusty. That dog was old. Slow. He barely made it to the end of the driveway. Running off didn't make sense. Then came the nights. At first I thought I was imagining it. But I'd wake up at odd hours and hear something. A low, rhythmic tapping. Not loud. Not random. Just constant. Like someone drumming their fingers against wood. And every time I checked my window, I'd see it. Frank's porch light. And Frank, standing on his front step, staring across the street, not moving. One night I worked up the nerve to watch longer, to see what he was actually looking at. And that's when I realized he wasn't staring at the street. He was staring at our house, at my bedroom window. I didn't tell my parents, didn't tell anyone, because what was I supposed to say? Hey, Frank's being weird? Maybe he's lonely? Maybe he misses his dog? I convinced myself it didn't matter, that Frank was just a little off, until the morning my dad found the rabbit. We had a small flower bed in the front yard. Nothing special, just some roses and tulips. But that morning my dad called me outside. Jesus Christ, he muttered. I followed his gaze, and froze, because there, right in the middle of the flower bed, was a dead rabbit. Its fur was soaked in something dark. His body was twisted, wrong, and someone had left it there, like a gift, like a warning. Think it's a coyote? I asked. My dad shook his head. No, a coyote would have eaten it. He knelt down, frowned. There's no blood. I stared at him. What? He pointed at the fur. Look, the rabbit's cut open, but there's no blood. Someone cleaned it out. My stomach turned. We buried the rabbit. Tried to forget about it. But that night, at 2:43 a.m., I woke up again. The same tapping sound. I pulled back the curtain. And this time, Frank wasn't on his porch. He was standing at the end of our driveway. Closer. His face hidden in the shadows. Still. Silent. Just watching. And in his hand, a shovel. I didn't sleep that night. Not after seeing Frank standing at the edge of our driveway. Not after seeing the shovel in his hand. I watched him for what felt like forever. He never moved. Never looked away. Just stood there. And then, at exactly 3 a.m., he turned. And walked back toward his house. The next morning, my dad was already outside, filling the bird feeder. I almost didn't say anything. But then I saw it. The footprints. Leading from the driveway to the flower bed, to the spot where we buried the rabbit. The dirt was disturbed, dug up, like someone had opened the grave. I swallowed hard. Dad! He turned, followed my gaze. His face darkened. Get inside. That same day, the neighborhood started talking. First, just small things. Mrs. Kenner's cat went missing. Ava McCarthy swore she saw someone outside her bedroom window at night. Someone knocked on the Jacobs' back door at 2 a.m., but when they checked, no one was there. Something was wrong, but no one wanted to say it out loud. By the weekend, my dad had had enough. I came downstairs and saw him loading his shotgun. Where are you going? I asked. He slung it over his shoulder. To talk to Frank. My stomach dropped. Dad, don't. Stay inside. Then he walked out the front door. I ran to the window. Watched as my dad marched down the street. Frank's house looked different. The grass was overgrown. The mailbox was stuffed with uncollected letters. The porch light was still on. Even in the middle of the day, my dad reached the door, knocked, no answer, knocked again, louder. Frank! Nothing. Then the door creaked open, just a little, just enough to see that someone had been standing behind it, and just enough for my dad to step inside. Minutes passed. Too many. I started to panic. Then my dad came out, fast, walking quickly down the driveway. His face was pale, like he'd seen something he wasn't supposed to. He got to the house, locked the door behind him, and turned to me. "You stay away from Frank, you hear me?" I nodded. "What did you see?" He hesitated, like he wasn't sure if he should say it. Then he finally whispered, "There were pictures." My skin crawled. Pictures of what? Of us. After that day, my dad wouldn't talk about what he saw in Frank's house. Not to me, not to my mom, but something changed in him. He started locking every door, every window, started checking the front yard at night, started keeping the shotgun next to his chair whenever we watched TV. That Sunday, the McCarthy twins disappeared. Their mom, Dana, called the cops, said the boys had been playing in the backyard. She went inside for 5 minutes. When she came back, they were gone. No sign of them, no footprints, nothing. After that, people stopped going outside at night. Garage lights stayed on. Doors were double-bolted. Felt like the whole neighborhood was waiting for something. Waiting for Frank. I didn't sleep much anymore. Every night, I'd wake up at the same time. 2:43 a.m. Like something was pulling me awake. Every night, I'd hear that same sound. That low, rhythmic tapping. And every night, I'd look outside. And I'd see him. Standing in his yard. Or standing in the street. Or standing in someone's driveway. Always watching. Always waiting. Then came the blood. It started with the Jacobsons. They woke up to find thick, dark stains on their front steps. The next day, the Lanes. A long streak of red smeared down their driveway. It happened house after house. Until one morning, I heard my mom scream. I ran outside. Our sidewalk was covered in blood. Thick, dark, fresh, leading from our front yard, straight to Frank's house. The cops finally came. 2 squad cars. Sheriff Harlan and 3 deputies. They knocked. Waited. No answer. Sheriff Harlan pounded harder. "Frank Henshaw, this is Halloway PD. We need to talk." Still nothing. Then one of the deputies pointed. "Sir, the window." We all looked. Frank was standing in the window, not hiding, not moving, just standing there staring out. His face was expressionless. His eyes were black in the morning light, like he wasn't really there, like he wasn't really human anymore. The sheriff had had enough. He signaled to the deputies. They moved toward the door. One of them pulled a crowbar from the trunk. Another rested his hand on his holster. The neighborhood stood still, watching, waiting. Frank never moved, never blinked, just watched, until the deputies broke down the door. And then, we heard the screams. The moment the deputies forced open the door, the smell hit them. I saw it happen. Sheriff Harlan and his men didn't even step inside at first. They just stood there, faces twisted in disgust. One of them gagged. The other swore under his breath. Then, after a long moment, Harlan took a deep breath and stepped inside. The others followed. And the moment they crossed the threshold, we heard the screams. My mom grabbed my arm. "Inside. Now." But I couldn't move. None of us could. Half the neighborhood was outside watching, waiting. Some people pulled out their phones, recording. Others just stood there, frozen in place. And then the first deputy ran back out. His face was pale, hands shaking violently. He bent over and threw up in the grass. The crowd stirred. People started murmuring, asking questions. But no one had answers. Then a second deputy staggered out. He didn't throw up, didn't say a word, just stood there, silent and wide-eyed, like he had seen something that broke his brain. I felt sick. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to see. But then Sheriff Harlan walked out, his gun drawn. His face was stone, and his voice low and hard. Everyone, go back inside. Now. People started backing away. Moms grabbed their kids. Some of the neighbors ran. But my dad didn't move. He took a step forward. Harlan, what's going on? Harlan shook his head. Tom, don't. Don't what? My dad snapped. Don't ask. Don't try to understand what the hell has been happening on our street. Harlan closed his eyes. He looked exhausted. Then he turned to the deputy who had thrown up. Get everyone inside. Tape off the house. Call in forensics. The deputy nodded, still shaking. And then, finally, the sheriff looked at my dad and said the words that made my stomach turn to ice. We found the McCarthy boys. The street went dead silent. No one moved. No one breathed. For a long time, no one spoke. Then my mom whispered, Are they okay? Harlan didn't answer, didn't even blink. And in that moment I already knew, they were gone. My dad didn't speak, didn't press for more, just grabbed my shoulder and pulled me inside. Mom locked the doors, pulled the curtains shut, but I still heard the sirens, still saw the flashing lights, still felt the weight of what was happening. 2 kids were dead, and Frank Henshaw was the reason why. They took him out of the house 2 hours later. No fight, no screaming, no struggle. He just walked out, his face completely blank, like he wasn't even there, like none of this mattered. His hands were cuffed, but his jacket was soaked. Something dark, something thick. My stomach twisted. I knew what it was. Frank didn't look at the crowd, didn't look at the cameras. But then he turned his head, and for a single moment he looked at me, right into my eyes, and he smiled, just for a second. And then they shoved him into the car and took him away. That night, the entire street stayed awake. No one slept. No one even tried. Every single house had their lights on, their doors locked, because none of us could stop thinking about it. What they found inside his house, and what Frank had been doing for years. The next morning, the details started leaking. People talked. The news spread, and we finally learned the truth. About Frank, about the blood, about the McCarthy boys, and about the other things they found inside. The police report said Frank's house was filled with cameras, not on the outside, on the inside. Tiny, hidden surveillance cameras in every single room. Each one pointed at a different chair, and every chair had the same thing. Straps, bolts drilled into the wood, like they were meant to hold someone down. And the basement? That's where they found the McCarthy twins, lying on the floor, side by side, their hands bound with duct tape, their faces covered, and near them, an old VHS camera still recording. The tape inside was labeled, with a date, not from last week, not from this year, but from 5 years ago, and it was already halfway rewound, like someone had been watching it. And the worst part? The part that nobody could explain? They found other tapes, dozens, each one with a different date, each one labeled with a different name. And when they checked those names, most of them didn't exist. No missing persons reports, no school records, no families looking for them. Just empty names, empty tapes, empty graves. And in the middle of it all, Frank, living in that house, waving at his neighbors, walking his dog, pretending he was normal, while all along he had been watching, waiting, and taking people whenever he wanted. That night, the street was silent. Nobody spoke. Nobody sat on their porches, because we all knew, could have been any of us, any of our kids, any of our families, and nobody would have known, until it was too late. The night they took Frank Henshaw away, the entire street stayed awake. People sat in their living rooms, their porches, their kitchens, just staring at the walls, not talking, not moving, just trying to understand how they had lived next to a monster for years, and never noticed. My parents barely spoke. My dad just kept pacing the house, checking the locks. My mom sat at the kitchen table, holding a cup of tea she never drank. And me? I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, knowing deep down that this wasn't over. Frank was gone. But whatever he had been doing in that house, that was still here, waiting to be discovered. The next morning, the street was empty. No kids riding their bikes. No neighbors tending their lawns. Just people inside, hiding. The police had already left, but they left behind yellow crime scene tape stretched across Frank's porch. His front door was boarded shut. His windows were covered with black plastic. It should have felt over, but it didn't. Not yet, because by sundown someone found one last tape, and it changed everything. The tape, it was Ben Parker's dad who found it. A retired handyman, he had helped build half the houses on Sycamore Lane. The day after the cops left, he decided to do one last check on Frank's property, just to make sure the police hadn't missed anything. That's when he noticed the basement floor. One of the tiles was loose, so he pried it up, and underneath, a hidden crawl space, with one last VHS tape inside. There was no label, no date, just black marker scribbled across the plastic. "Watch me." Ben's dad didn't go to the cops, didn't tell anyone, not at first, because there was one thing about Frank Henshaw that no one could explain. One thing that had been bothering the entire town. Where were the bodies? The McCarthy boys had been found. But what about the others? What about all the other names on those tapes? If Frank had been doing this for years, where were the remains? Where had he been hiding them? Or worse, were some of them still alive? Ben's dad had to know, so he plugged the tape into an old player, and he hit play. The video, the screen flickered to life, static, then a room, not the basement, not the living room, a small windowless space, cement walls, dim light, and a chair, with someone sitting in it. The person was thin, malnourished, arms strapped to the chair, head slumped forward. At first, Ben's dad thought they were dead. But then the figure lifted its head, and he saw their face, and he started screaming, because he recognized them. It was Daniel Garrison, a boy who had gone missing 12 years ago, a boy everyone thought had run away, but he hadn't. He had been here, trapped, somewhere in town, for over a decade. The video continued. The camera didn't move, didn't pan. It was just a still shot of the room. Frank's voice came from somewhere off-screen. "Tell them where you are, Danny." The boy looked up. His lips trembled. Then he started crying. "Please," he whispered. "Please, let me go." Frank chuckled. Now, be polite." Daniel shook his head. "Please, someone help me. Please, I don't want to be here anymore." Then the screen cut to static, and the tape ended. The final realization. Ben's dad didn't sleep that night, didn't tell anyone about the tape, didn't call the police, because the more he thought about it, the more something didn't make sense. The basement was searched, the attic too. Every inch of Frank's house was scanned. There was no secret room. So, where was Daniel? Where had Frank been keeping him? And more importantly, was he still there? The nightmare isn't over. The next morning, Ben's dad left town, packed his bags, drove away, didn't tell anyone where he was going, didn't leave a note, just disappeared. And that's when people started asking questions, started checking the records. And finally, someone noticed the pattern. Frank wasn't the only one. For the last 20 years, people had been vanishing from Holloway. Not just kids, adults too. Some moved away, some ran off. Some just disappeared without a trace. And every single person who left town in the past 2 decades had lived on Sycamore Lane. The final message. A week after the tape was found, Ben received a text. No number, no contact, just a single message. "Don't dig anymore." Ben never responded, never told anyone, just deleted it. But I know what it meant. We all did. Frank wasn't working alone. People started moving out, selling their houses. By the end of the year, half the street was empty. By the next year, only 2 houses had lights on at night. And by the 3rd year, Sycamore Lane was completely abandoned, overgrown, forgotten, like it had never existed. Nobody lives there now. The houses still stand, their windows boarded shut, their driveways cracked and covered in weeds. Nobody goes near them, not because they're haunted, not because people are scared, but because deep down, we all know the truth. The street isn't empty, not really, because we never found the bodies. And whoever helped Frank Henshaw, they never left.